Most cybersecurity videos talk about protecting yourself from hackers. This one is a little different. Today, I want to talk about a document that is supposed to protect all of us at a national level, one that barely made headlines when it came out, even though it represents a real shift in how America plans to handle cyber threats going forward. Welcome to Cyber Safety Brief, where we explain simple cybersecurity advice for everyday Americans. Before we go further, here is something important. This video is based on authentic, legal, and publicly available cybersecurity information. Everything here is for awareness and understanding only. I am not here to promote or criticize any political administration. I am here to explain what this strategy actually says in plain language so you understand what it could mean for you. Here is what I am not going to do in this video. I am not going to tell you the government has a secret plan you don't know about. That is exaggerated, and honestly, this document is publicly available for anyone to read. What I am going to do is walk you through what this strategy actually contains, because most people have heard the phrase National Cybersecurity Strategy without ever understanding what it actually does or how it affects them personally. Let's start with some quick context. In March 2026, the White House released a document called President Trump's Cyber Strategy for America, alongside an executive order focused on combating cybercrime and fraud. In my opinion, the most immediately noticeable thing about this document is its length. Where the previous National Cybersecurity Strategy, released in 2023, was long and detailed, this new version is famously short, just a handful of pages. That brevity itself tells you something about the philosophy behind it, which we will get into. Point 1. 6 pillars, 1 clear direction. Let's talk about the structure first, because understanding the 6 pillars this strategy is built around makes everything else easier to follow. The strategy organizes its priorities into 6 core areas: deterrence and disruption of adversaries, promoting what the strategy calls common sense regulation, modernizing and securing federal government networks, securing critical infrastructure, sustaining leadership in critical and emerging technologies, and building the cybersecurity workforce of the future. Here is the part that surprises people. Reading through these 6 pillars, you can immediately tell this strategy is less focused on detailed technical guidance and more focused on setting a general direction, with the specifics expected to follow later through separate policy actions. In my opinion, this is a meaningful departure from how previous strategies were written, which tended to lay out much more detailed, prescriptive plans directly within the strategy document itself. What I personally think is worth understanding is why this shift happened. National cybersecurity strategies are not laws. They do not create new legal requirements on their own. They function more like a mission statement that guides how federal agencies prioritize funding, staffing, and policy focus over the following years. The 2003 strategy under President Bush was the first comprehensive national strategy of its kind, focused heavily on basic awareness and coordination. The 2018 strategy expanded significantly on workforce development and international partnerships. The 2023 strategy went further still, introducing detailed regulatory expectations and a stronger emphasis on holding software makers accountable for building secure products from the start. Seen against that history, the 2026 strategy is a genuine outlier in how condensed it is, and that brevity is itself a policy choice, not an oversight. Point 2. Deterrence means something different. This time. Now let's dig into the first and arguably most talked about pillar, deterrence. What I personally think is genuinely new here is the emphasis on what the strategy calls deploying both defensive and offensive cyber capabilities. Previous strategies have focused heavily on defense, meaning protecting systems from attacks. This strategy explicitly signals a willingness to use offensive operations as well, meaning actively disrupting the infrastructure that cybercriminals and hostile foreign actors use to launch attacks in the first place. Here is a real-life example that helps explain what this looks like in practice. The strategy talks about wanting to dismantle criminal infrastructure, including the financial systems that cybercriminal groups rely on. This is not simply about blocking an attack after it happens, It is about actively working to take down the tools and networks attackers use before they can strike again. In my opinion, this is a genuinely more aggressive posture than what previous administrations have publicly committed to in a strategy document. The strategy notes that responses to malicious cyber activity will not be confined strictly to the cyber domain alone, hinting at a broader, more integrated national security approach where cyber operations work alongside other tools of national power. In my opinion, this signals that the current administration views cyberspace less as a separate, isolated category and more as one connected piece of overall national defense strategy, similar to how it treats traditional military or diplomatic tools. The strategy also mentions wanting to unleash the private sector to help identify and disrupt adversary networks. This is where things get interesting and, honestly, a little complicated. What I personally think is worth clarifying here is that this does not currently authorize private companies to launch their own offensive cyber attacks against hackers, something often called hacking back, which remains illegal under existing U.S. law. Instead, the strategy signals a desire for closer cooperation between government agencies and private companies, particularly technology and cybersecurity firms, in identifying and responding to threats. The way I look at it, this is less about individual citizens taking action and more about large companies working more closely with federal agencies than they have before. There is another piece of this pillar worth mentioning, because it connects deterrence to something that has already happened, not just something planned for the future. The strategy references operations against groups like transnational criminal organizations and describes wanting to impose real, tangible costs on cyber adversaries, whether through sanctions, coordinated law enforcement action, or direct disruption of the infrastructure these groups rely on. In my opinion, the underlying logic here is fairly simple to understand, even if the execution is complicated. If attacking American systems remains cheap and low risk for criminals and hostile state actors, those attacks will keep happening. The strategy is essentially betting that raising the cost and risk of launching an attack in the first place will reduce how often these attacks occur, rather than relying purely on getting better at defending against attacks after they start. I also want to mention the workforce angle briefly here, since it connects directly to this offensive posture. The strategy frames the cybersecurity workforce as a strategic national asset and notably shifts emphasis compared to earlier strategies. Where the 2018 strategy focused heavily on training traditional technical roles like network defenders and incident responders, and the 2023 strategy emphasized governance and risk management skills, this new strategy calls for rapidly expanding talent specifically skilled in autonomous systems and AI-enabled defense tools. In my opinion, this reflects a broader industry trend, not just a government preference. As more routine security tasks become automated, the human role increasingly shifts toward managing and overseeing intelligent systems rather than performing every task manually. Point 3. Streamlining regulation, but what does that actually mean? The second pillar focuses on what the strategy calls promoting common sense regulation, and this is a phrase worth unpacking carefully. In my opinion, this pillar reflects a genuine tension that has existed in cybersecurity policy for years. On one side, businesses have long argued that overlapping, duplicative federal and state cybersecurity regulations create unnecessary compliance costs without necessarily improving actual security. On the other side, consumer advocates worry that reducing regulation could weaken protections that currently exist for a reason. Here's what most people underestimate about this pillar. It directly connects to an existing law called the Cyber Incident Reporting for Critical Infrastructure Act, often abbreviated CIRCIA, which requires certain companies to report major cyber incidents to the government within a set time frame. The strategy signals an intention to revise how this law is implemented, aligning it more closely with what industry groups have been asking for, potentially reducing some reporting burdens while aiming to keep the core goal of timely incident reporting intact. What I personally think is genuinely important to understand here is the phrase streamlined but not weaker, at least as the strategy's supporters describe it. The stated goal is not to eliminate accountability, but to reduce duplicate, overlapping requirements that currently force some companies to report similar information to multiple different agencies in slightly different formats. In my opinion, this is a legitimate problem worth solving. A hospital or bank dealing with an active security incident should be focused on containing the damage, not filling out 5 nearly identical government forms. Whether the actual implementation lives up to that stated goal, though, is something that will only become clear once the specific rulemaking process plays out, and that process was still ongoing with public town halls being planned to gather industry feedback. Let me know in the comments if you agree with this, because I think a lot of people assume more regulation always means more protection, when in reality, the relationship between regulation and actual security outcomes is genuinely more complicated than that. I also want to mention a related point about state and local government, since it connects directly to this regulatory pillar. The strategy explicitly frames state, local, tribal, and territorial cybersecurity authorities as a complement to national efforts, not a substitute for them. In my opinion, this framing matters because it suggests the federal government still expects to hold primary responsibility for setting the overall direction, even while acknowledging that state and local governments play an important supporting role, particularly since many critical infrastructure systems, like water utilities, are actually owned and operated at the local level rather than by the federal government directly. Point 4. Modernizing federal networks and securing critical infrastructure. The third and fourth pillars focus on something a little more technical, but still directly relevant to everyday Americans: securing the systems the government relies on and the infrastructure the entire country depends on. The strategy calls for accelerating the adoption of post-quantum cryptography, a type of encryption designed to remain secure even against future quantum computers, which could theoretically break many of today's encryption methods. It also calls for wider adoption of what is known as zero-trust architecture, a security approach based on the idea that no user or device should be automatically trusted, even if it is already inside a supposedly secure network. In my opinion, the emphasis on artificial intelligence throughout this strategy deserves special attention. The document repeatedly highlights wanting to deploy AI-powered cybersecurity tools to defend federal networks and detect intrusions at scale. This connects directly to something we have discussed in previous videos: the growing role AI plays in cybersecurity generally, both as a defensive tool and, in the wrong hands, as a potential attack tool as well. Here is a real-life example that makes the critical infrastructure pillar feel less abstract. The strategy specifically names sectors like energy, financial services, telecommunications, data centers, water utilities, and healthcare as priorities for protection. What I personally think is worth remembering here is that these are not abstract systems. These are the power grid that keeps your lights on, the water treatment systems that keep your tap water safe, and the hospital systems that handle emergency care. When cybersecurity strategy documents talk about critical infrastructure, they are really talking about the basic services your daily life depends on. There is a supply chain angle to this pillar that I think deserves its own explanation, because it connects to a decision that actually affects consumer purchases. The strategy emphasizes reducing reliance on technology vendors based in countries considered adversarial, continuing a policy trend that has been building since 2019, when federal agencies were first barred from using equipment from certain foreign telecommunications companies. That policy expanded over the following years to restrict the sale and import of new equipment from those same companies more broadly. In my opinion, the logic connects directly back to the deterrence pillar we discussed earlier. If foreign-made hardware sitting inside American networks can potentially be used as an entry point for attacks by state-linked hacking groups, then restricting that hardware becomes a defensive measure just as much as an offensive one is on the other side of the strategy. The strategy also calls for advancing supply chain security more broadly, encouraging both public and private organizations to prioritize technology built and secured domestically or by trusted allied nations, from initial design through final deployment. In my opinion, this reflects a growing recognition across multiple recent administrations that cybersecurity and hardware manufacturing are no longer separate issues. Where a device is made and who has access to its design and manufacturing process has become a genuine national security consideration, not just a cost or quality question. Point 5. What this actually means for regular people. This is the part I think really matters, because so far, this might sound like a policy discussion that has nothing to do with your daily life. It absolutely connects. Here is what most people underestimate. National cybersecurity strategies rarely create immediate, visible changes for individual citizens. What they do is set priorities that eventually shape things like how quickly a hospital's systems get updated after a ransomware attack, how fast your bank has to report a data breach, and how much of your tax dollars go toward defending government systems that store your personal information, like the IRS or the Social Security Administration. In my opinion, one detail that deserves more attention is the strategy's approach to foreign-made hardware. Around the same period this strategy was released, federal regulators moved to restrict foreign-manufactured consumer routers, citing concerns that this equipment had been directly implicated in attacks against American infrastructure by state-linked hacking groups. The way I look at it, this connects directly to something practical you might not expect from a national strategy document, the actual physical hardware sitting in people's homes. If you are shopping for a new router in the coming months, this is genuinely relevant information, not just abstract policy. Here is another practical connection worth understanding. The strategy's emphasis on modernizing federal systems, including a stated goal of transitioning federal agencies to post-quantum cryptography by a set future deadline, matters more to regular people than the technical language suggests. Federal agencies like the IRS and the Social Security Administration hold enormous amounts of personal data: your income history, your Social Security number, your benefits information. If those systems remain vulnerable to advanced decryption methods years down the line, especially as quantum computing technology matures, the personal data stored in government systems today could theoretically become exposed retroactively. In my opinion, this is exactly the kind of slow-moving, unglamorous infrastructure work that rarely makes headlines but genuinely matters for long-term data protection. I also think it is worth mentioning the geopolitical backdrop this strategy was released into, because strategies do not exist in a vacuum. The document was published during a period of heightened cyber activity connected to broader international tensions, including cyber operations tied to ongoing conflicts in multiple regions. In my opinion, this context explains some of the urgency and more aggressive tone found throughout the document, compared to strategies released during calmer geopolitical periods. Whether that urgency translates into effective policy execution is, of course, a separate question entirely from whether the underlying concern is legitimate. I would also like to know your opinion. Do you think a more aggressive, offense-focused cybersecurity posture makes the country genuinely safer, or do you think it risks escalating conflict with other nations in ways that could eventually affect regular people? I am genuinely curious what people think, because this is one of those topics where reasonable, well-informed people can land in very different places. Point 6. The honest criticism of this strategy. Before I wrap up, I want to be fair and mention the criticism this strategy has received, because a one-sided take would not be honest. The most consistent criticism, in my opinion, is about the strategy's brevity itself. At only a handful of pages, many cybersecurity policy experts have pointed out that it lacks the kind of detailed, actionable guidance that helps organizations actually understand how to prepare. A previous administration strategy ran many pages longer, with far more specific direction. Critics argue that without a more detailed follow-up action plan, government agencies and private companies may struggle to translate these 6 broad pillars into concrete, measurable steps. There is also an ongoing debate about the strategy's emphasis on encouraging private sector involvement in disrupting adversary networks. Some experts have raised genuine questions worth taking seriously. Will private companies be vetted before taking on this kind of role? What legal liability protections, if any, would apply to companies that get involved? How would a private company even verify it is targeting the right adversary before taking any action? In my opinion, these are not small technical questions. They touch on real legal and ethical issues that a 5-page strategy document simply cannot fully resolve on its own. Another point of honest criticism relates to how this strategy handles international cooperation compared to its predecessor. The 2023 strategy placed significant emphasis on building international partnerships and coordinating with allied nations on shared cyber defense. In my opinion, the 2026 strategy notably de-emphasizes that international partnership angle in favor of a more independent, America-focused posture, while still highlighting cooperation with allies specifically around banning equipment from adversarial technology vendors. Whether this shift strengthens America's position or reduces valuable international coordination during a period when cyber threats are increasingly global in nature is, honestly, a genuinely open question that different experts answer differently depending on their broader views of foreign policy. There is also a practical concern raised by several policy analysts about execution capacity. The strategy sets ambitious goals across all 6 pillars, but it arrives at a time when some federal agencies, including parts of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, have experienced staffing and budget changes. In my opinion, this creates a legitimate question worth watching closely over the coming months. A strategy is only as effective as the agencies tasked with carrying it out, and if those agencies face resource constraints, even well-designed pillars may struggle to translate into the kind of measurable, on-the-ground improvements the strategy envisions. I would also like to know your opinion here specifically. Do you think a shorter, higher-level strategy document actually allows for more flexibility and faster adaptation as threats change? Or do you think the lack of detail genuinely weakens how effectively it can be implemented across dozens of different federal agencies and private sector partners? I am genuinely curious what people think because I have seen thoughtful arguments made on both sides of this specific question. If this video helps you understand online safety more clearly, like the video and subscribe to Cyber Safety Brief for more simple cybersecurity advice. Closing. Here is the honest summary. The 2026 National Cybersecurity Strategy shifts the United States toward a more aggressive, offense-inclusive posture, emphasizes reducing regulatory burden through what it calls common-sense reform, prioritizes modernizing federal systems with post-quantum cryptography and AI-powered tools, restricts adversarial hardware from critical networks and consumer devices, and calls for deeper cooperation between government agencies and the private sector in identifying and disrupting cyber threats. It is short on specific detail, which has drawn genuine criticism from policy experts. It de-emphasizes some of the international partnership focus of its predecessor and many of its biggest questions, like the private sector's exact role in offensive operations and whether agencies have the resources to execute it fully, remain unresolved. That is not meant to scare you. It is meant to help you understand the direction national cybersecurity policy is heading, so you can follow the story with real understanding instead of just headlines, and so you can recognize how a document written in Washington eventually shapes things as ordinary as which router sits in your living room or how quickly your bank has to tell you about a data breach. Stay alert, stay informed, and stay safe online. Before you go, comment below which pillar of this strategy you think matters most.